Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you here with us today. Today is first of two sessions on anti-hate and anti-bias policy in your district. And so let me see. So today I've asked Superintendent McGee to come say a few words to get us started. And then the Anti-Defamation League will set some context for us and give us some background, some history, some information, some good stuff. I will follow up with just some high-level findings from the grand jury, one of the reasons why we're here today, as well as just educational considerations for your district policy on anti-bias and anti-hate. We'll talk about policy components, so things that really should be in your policies as you guys are drafting them. And then we'll also talk about the next session. So this is one of two sessions, so we'll talk about what will be involved in the next session. And so all the links that are in my presentation today, the samples that I have for you, as well as a PDF of the slides, I will send you in a follow-up. That's for later. So at this time, let me see if I can find where Superintendent McGee is. Oh, there you are. Thank you for waving. So I want to unmute you. Oops, you moved. Are you able to unmute yourself now?
I am.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Niambi. It's really a very important moment for me to be here with all of you today. I will be the first to recognize how much is swirling around you, how much is on your desk and your to-do list. There's just some moments when we cannot set a certain activity or task aside and let it arrive back up to the top of the to-do list. The emergency of COVID-19 has exposed so many needs and stressors on our children. In the middle of all that, our country has experienced incredible upheaval around social justice issues. And if we really want to aspire to serve every single child in our schools in a safe and supportive way and ensure they have access to every opportunity to be successful, then we must be here today for this conversation. So thank you so much for making the time. I'm going to be fairly quick, but as you know, a lot of this activity actually parallels to a prior grand jury report in 2011, where the grand jury explored anti-bullying and harassment on our school campuses. And when they explored all the policies of all the different 23 school districts, of course, you can imagine that they were all over the place, right? The language was not common. There were different aspects of some policies in some districts that were not present in others. And the grand jury's assessment is that policy really builds us a strong foundation to stand on, and it gives us a great opportunity to express our vision for the kind of school settings that we want to be enforcing. So once again, we have continuing incidents of bias, harassment, and hate going on in our communities that is going to spill over onto our school campuses and across students. So I do feel that it is one of our #1 priorities in assuring the safety and a strong environment for learning, that we take as many steps as possible to secure strong foundations. So in 2011, we held a policy symposium. We had all 23 districts in the same room. Those were different times. Everybody brought all their policy documents, and we spent 2 different sessions sort of helping people shape, improving and strengthening their policies, and then sharing them out. So this seemed like a good opportunity to do that again, only focusing on specifically on bias and hate. You may know that across the county, we've worked really hard from the county office to establish some systems that use common language. One of those systems in our safe and supportive schools work is the Big Five. The Big Five is a common protocol of immediate actions in response to an emergency on a school campus in San Mateo County. Because in San Mateo County, we have 23 districts, we have 20 different law enforcement agencies, we have multiple community partners, and when everybody is using different language, we tend to misunderstand and miscommunicate. And these are things that break our foundation and put cracks in our foundation. So I believe that the policy work around some common understandings and some common language can set San Mateo County apart in establishing strong anti-racist learning settings that support every child. And yes, I'm using the term anti-racist, which has come into the nomenclature just in the last year or two. At the County Office of Education, we are right now as a workforce all reading the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And we're learning the vocabulary so that we don't just repeat the words. We're really talking and exchanging. What does this mean? How does it feel when I say these things? So I want to just go out and say that the County Office of Education is working very hard to be an anti-racist organization. And I'll say one more thing, and that is that I spent 20 years as a classroom high school English teacher. Very rarely did I teach grammar straight up, but I did address what makes good writing, because good writing is good communication, and good communication can change the world. So my understanding of using the term and adopting and moving into the sense of what an anti-racist organization is sort of the idea of being active or passive. And we all know, if we know anything about writing, we know that when we use the passive voice, it's a much softer, less emphatic, more circuitous way of saying something or making your idea known. And to as opposed to using active verbs and putting that subject right up front. So the idea of being anti-racist is more of a sense of active versus passive. I am actively proclaiming that we strive to write and support policy that serves every single child, regardless of race, ethnicity, ability, socioeconomic status, because we genuinely believe that every child deserves full access to all the things that a public education system can offer. And so with that, I'm going to thank you so much for you being here. I want to make sure that everyone knows that the County Office of Education is also going to be working on our board policies and our policy language so that we can strengthen our positions to support our students and our programs. So we are sitting right along beside you in this work. So thank you for leaning in, for making time today for this incredibly important conversation. And I look forward to working with all of you as we head into the next few years, bringing our students back on campus, establishing a new and inspired sense of safety and support in an anti-racist county. So Niambi, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Really appreciate those words. I am going to actually turn it over to Samantha now from the Anti-Defamation League, Samantha Brown, who has some additional information and words to share with you.
Thank you, Niambi. I am going to share my screen with you all. So just give me a moment. There's never a dull moment on Zoom.
Yes.
Figure out how to navigate this space after a year. So 1 second. All right, and everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Good. Okay, sounds good. So thank you for having me today. Again, my name is Samantha Brown. I am the Education Director at ADL Central Pacific Region. And so our region covers or works with partners throughout Northern California, the state of Utah, and Hawaii. And so partnering through our education work to bring safe, inclusive school spaces and guide young people and adults who support them to do the same. So I'm really glad to be here with you today, and thank you for again inviting me to your space for what is really, as Nancy said, an important conversation around how we engage in equitable and inclusive decision making when it comes to creating policy. And so just a cheat. Nobody can see my notes, correct? Because I do have notes. All right. And so just a little bit about me. I am from the Bay Area, for the most part, originally from Southern California, but I've been in the Bay Area most of my life. So I would say that I know the demographics of the Bay Area and Bay Area communities well enough. So I know that you all face unique challenges depending on where you are and who you serve. And that's something that definitely has to be considered. And so some of you may know the Anti-Defamation League, some of you may not, but we are an anti-hate organization started in 1913 with the mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And our organization really was started in response to rising anti-Semitism during that time, as well as in response to the lynching of a young Jewish man named Leo Frank. And since then, our mission, we have worked according to this mission because we understand that bias is absolutely universal, that we all develop bias through our socialization, through education, exposure to media, and other kinds of information. But what we also understand is that bias is learned. So it can be overcome, it can be challenged. Our prejudicial attitudes and thinking can be challenged and changed. And so we believe that where the power lies is in our ability, right, to walk through that and not act on that bias, right? Not shut it down and not ignore it, but to really address it and make the conscious decision to act differently, to believe differently. And we know that that's not easy. So in no way are we saying that this is an easy choice or that we're always going to get it right, but that we have to commit to it. And so, the way in which we approach our work, we say that we mainly do three things, and that is investigate, advocate, and educate, and in specific areas. So if you didn't know, ADL really does tackle cyber hate and extremism, both online and on the ground. So that's through our tracking, that's through the investigation of hate crimes and hate incidents, both in schools as well as in communities. And then really advocating for communities to make sure that there are policies, that there are laws in place. Folks actually don't know that ADL is responsible for helping to draft the first ever hate crime bill or the original language for hate crime legislation in the United States, and recently got the hate bill passed in the state of Georgia, as well as in the state of Utah about 3 years ago. And we know that that's no small feat. We live in a place, for those of us who are from California, raise of hands, how many of us are from California? Many of us? Yeah, we take a lot of things for granted. And we take for granted that, we are in a place where, for the most part, there's protection for certain things, under the law. But still, we know that for many of us, we don't feel protected under the law. And so we have to start to do things and react to that, react in a way that changes that phenomena. The next way is through promoting respectful schools and communities. So our education programs really are developed to help youth and adults confront bias and understand and appreciate differences and create inclusive spaces. And so while our programs are for our programs are directed through our K through 12 students, what we also try to do is equip adults, right? Equip the folks who support them, so families and educators, to support and empower young folks. And then also to change our thinking and behavior and understanding of how the biased attitudes and behaviors that we model really impacts young people and the adults that they grow up to be. And we again know that this is no easy feat. And so we do that in a few different ways, as you can see through our bullying and cyberbullying, our anti-bias education, and there are interfaith and intergroup relations work. And I'm going to go through some of this fairly quickly, but I will pause for questions. As you all know, it's hard to see chat or it's hard to see questions or raise hands on while you're presenting. So just hold those questions, write them down, and I will pause periodically to take those questions. All right, so we approach our education work through these four pillars. And so the first one is exploring identity. And we really understand that we have to start with ourselves and critically examine how our own bias and ideology and values impact our decision-making, where they come from. And so for our conversation today, right, we're going to be thinking about how our own biases and beliefs impact the decisions we make in our district, and we, right, in our own, or our being, right, your team or stakeholders in your district, as well as yourself, because I gather that you are all here because you are leaders, right? Your stakeholders, you're the ones who are shaping the culture of these campus communities. And so we really need to start to think about that. And so our objective here today really is, again, to examine our own bias and what part they play in our interactions and decision-making as they relate to our roles. And so as we take a critical look, right, at our own biases and, where they come from, what they are, it requires us to know our communities. It requires us to know the demographics of our school districts, right? Who is visible, who's not, whose voices are valued, whose voices are not. Whose safety is considered when we're making these policies or we're responding to these things, because we can't acknowledge, right, what we don't necessarily see. And so one of the things I like to remind people is that it is easy to embrace diversity. So a lot of times I meet folks and they are quote unquote social justice warriors and champions of the work. And it's easy to do that, right? It's easy to say that we embrace diversity until our own perceptions are challenged, right? Or until we are introduced to new identities, until our community demographics change, or the dynamics of our communities change, or until we are introduced to the idea or have to really put in action the idea of creating equity, right? Or providing everyone with what they need, even folks that we don't necessarily see or are not seen as much. So I want to just get you all thinking about, how do we push ourselves a little bit? How do we unearth and how do we start to uncover? And I'm not going to put anybody on the spot and necessarily ask them to talk about it, but how do we start recognizing our own biases, right? You might say like, oh, I'm a teacher and I've worked and I've done this work for so long and I love all my students, right? I love all my students, but I bet we can all think of some kids that were like, not so much, right? Some folks that were like, this has really been a challenge for me, whether it's because I don't understand them, right? Maybe you don't quite agree with, how they show up in spaces, or with their own beliefs or practices, but we have to start again pushing the envelope to challenge ourselves to think about, our bias and what form that takes. And so any questions about that? I'm just going to pause for a moment. And if you can use the raise hand feature, Nyambi, you can call on and I'll take a question or two. And if there's none, I will keep going.
I see one raised hand, Malia. So I will ask her to unmute if her hand is raised for that reason.
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay, no
Okay,
problem.
thank you.
Any other questions at this time?
Okay.
Okay.
I will keep going. So we illustrate the escalation of bias through what we call our pyramid of hate. And some of you may or may not have seen this before. Oh, I do see a hand raised. It says Ellen. Ellen, go ahead and unmute yourself. Sorry. Are you able to? Maybe could you unmute her?
Oh, great. I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think the piece that you talked about as far as exploring identity is so valuable, and we are looking for more resources for our teachers at our school and staff to explore their own implicit bias. And I'm wondering if you have some resources to share so we can continue on that journey of exploring our own identities and our own biases and making more explicit and being self-aware about what's implicit. We did do a self-awareness implicit bias kind of quiz with our staff. So each person did that, but I'm wondering if you have more resources to share that we could use to help our staff with that process.
Absolutely, and we will get there. So just sit with me, and then we have some good stuff to share with you all.
Okay.
So thank you for asking that, because definitely we never want to leave you without resources. It's easy to come into a room and tell folks what they need to do and how they need to do it. And so we always like to provide some tools to be able to do that. So the pyramid of hate is what we use to illustrate the escalation of bias. And really the pyramid of hate is just an illustration of how biased behaviors and attitudes growing in complexity from bottom to top can escalate into negative actions, discrimination, violence, etc. And so we know that not all acts of bias will escalate, but we know that whether implicit or explicit, they have the potential to escalate quickly, and they both cause harm. So there's always this conversation, or we always get this question around like, well, what kind of bias is worse, implicit or explicit, right? It's all bad, right? It all has a potential to cause harm. So we really shouldn't be, I guess, caught up in the minutia of which one is worse. We should be trying to do what we can to disrupt it, right? And there really is a fine line between implicit and explicit bias, right? So folks will say, well, I have an implicit bias. Well, now that you know, right, is it implicit, right? Is it unconscious, right? Whether you decide to act on it or not. And so we have to be truthful with ourselves around what is, implicit, what is explicit, what we are conscious of and what we're not conscious of, right? Because often many of us will use that excuse. And I think that's our own human reaction, right? Not wanting to seem as if we are failing in some way, but we're just being human. And if we don't acknowledge that, if we don't challenge ourselves, then we'll continue to make the same mistakes. And that's, what we are seeing right now. And so, our young people, we know, are experiencing and trying to make sense of and even looking to validate their own biases. Their bias that they learn from their families, the bias that they learn in school settings, from our education, through the information that they are constantly receiving. And so we see them acting accordingly or reacting to attitudes and bias that's modeled by adults, right? So we can't act like we are not responsible. And I know that it is difficult because our students come to school with their stuff, right? We can't tell parents how to parent, but we can set guidelines and we can set parameters for how students are expected to behave, how parents are expected to engage and respond when they are in our campus communities. So we focus on, championing justice through anti-bias education because we understand that each of us really does play many roles in perpetuating cycles of bias. And so we know that without a doubt, right, each of us can probably recall a time that we've been a target of bias, that we've been an aggressor, a bystander, an ally, or all four of these, right? So none of us are exempt. And so we, again, need to start to think about how do we model and how do we put in place practices that promote a civil and a just society. As educators, we have to also understand that it is our responsibility to protect all children and ensure inclusive and safe spaces, right? Many of us, so many times we come to this space and we're like, this is a lot to do. I think Nancy said it well, you all have a lot on your plate, but that's what we sign up for, right? When we come here, when we come to this space, we decide that we will protect and we will make sure that all students have equitable opportunity to learn and to be their best selves. And so I think about this, I think about my role, and I think about when I came to ADL, right? Knowing the mission, knowing the vision, but I didn't have a choice to say, I don't want to stand up against anti-Semitism. I only want to stand up against other forms of hate. When I signed on, the decision was clear that my role was to confront all forms of hate. And so we have to think about it like that, right? It's like the oath that doctors take, right? Not to commit malpractice, right? So there are ethics attached to this. And so we really need to start thinking about that and naming that. And so one of the things that I also want to just kind of clarify about the pyramid of hate is that it's not a ranking necessarily of, which levels of thinking or behavior are more serious than others. It just really is to demonstrate how when we normalize behavior, it has the potential to escalate into something worse. So framing, so I do see a hand.
Yes, we have one.
Okay, nope. Okay, thank you. So before we begin to create effective policy, we have to be able to frame the problem. Okay, so many of us looking at this are probably not surprised at the numbers because we know that online, where we get most of our information, where most of us are engaging, most of our young people are engaging now, is where the majority of bias and hateful ideology is being spread. And so this really is telling of why we see the kind of behavior that we do from students, because students are vulnerable, right? They're imitating what they hear and what they see with either very little or no context, right? Or and really very little or no context from adults. So unfortunately, they're engaging in behavior that does not promote critical thinking. They're engaging in behavior that does not require of them to interrogate ideas, to interrogate ideology, right, when it should be. And so this is where young people are also finding connections and justifications for their attitudes and behaviors. This is where they're being preyed upon, and they're actively being targeted and recruited and harassed, right, because of their identity, because of algorithms, because of the things that they are seeking out online. And so this is a real threat. And so although this survey shows, this is actually an adult survey, it is again telling of what our young folks are experiencing and telling of the lack of knowledge and the lack of kind of safeguards, right? If you can imagine that this is the percentage of adults that are harassed, then we can only imagine how many students or how many folks under 18 are experiencing the same behavior because they don't know how to safeguard themselves. They don't know when to back up necessarily and say like, no, like this is enough, like this is not okay. And so one of the tools that we have on our website is called our heat map. And our heat map is an interactive and customizable map detailing hate, extremist and anti-Semitic activity by state and nationwide. And so if you go on our website, you can zoom in and out, you can look at it by county, all that good stuff. And it's created by our Center on Extremism that does extensive work on hate crimes and especially in the digital space. And so this is again, another reason why we need to have policy that speaks to promoting a just and inclusive society, because again, young folks are vulnerable to this violence, right? And so if we look at this, right, we look at this, and this is what our snapshot of the Bay Area, right? And so some of us may be surprised, some of us may not. I think over the last year, even the last 2 years, I've heard folks a range of ages, refer to our lovely Bay Area as safe, as inclusive, as diverse it is, as liberal, as accepting. But then, there's another truth to that, right? We are not exempt from the kind of violence and the kind of bias and the kind of hate that is present in other forms of the country, in other places. And we need to get out of that type of thinking, right? And so, quite literally, we have to provide guidelines for folks. And it seems silly, right, that we have to remind folks of these, but we quickly forget, especially when faced with difference, especially when faced with conflict. And again, human reaction, right? We become defensive, we start to think about our own interests. And so again, ever more important. And many of us really don't know the trends, right? Many of us don't even know that this is happening, right? We might hear a little bit of something, we might hear about what's happening just in our community, but we don't know the trends. And so we have a tendency to play down the threat of extremism, the threat of propaganda. And you all know from the events that have happened in some of your high schools in the last few years that this is a very real thing. One of the most present examples is this rise in hate against our AAPI community, right? Which many of us know is not new. And so like, even if we did a brief search, right, of last year, 2 years, 20 years ago, then we could easily find a timeline, right, of xenophobic propaganda, along with policies, along with legislation that's animated this type of rhetoric, right? And that's for not just AAPI communities, but many communities, right? So we can't say that this is new, right? And so when we were starting to report on these things, folks were playing it down. But we know, again, one thing that I like that Nancy mentioned was the importance of language, right? So many times we are in this discussion, in ADL and with partners around like, well, we should be able to say what we want to say in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and all those different things. And although I won't go into that, right, we don't have the right to cause harm, right? And we can't play down the fact that our words absolutely do matter, right? And they have the ability to incite riots, right? So while our words can cause joy and they can bring people together, they can also cause harm. And so we have to acknowledge that. We can't play down that fact. And especially in the information age, especially when we are doing less talking to people and less kind of gathering or really understanding of context and historical implications, and we're just grabbing for information online by whoever, from whoever. And so again, knowing what's happening and where is key. How are these things happening? Oh, I'm sorry. I do see a question. I will take your question in just a moment. So how are these things happening? And again, just through the normalization of bias, we're exposed to study stream and infiltration of like sexist, racist, homophobic memes, playing down of these things as jokes. And a lot of this is packaged as humor. But it easily transforms into hateful ideology and lures people into thinking that this is the way they should be, especially young people, right? When they see adults validating how they feel or answering their questions in ways that are not, that just make sense to them, because we know that for a lot of young people, they have not experienced the world. They don't know, again, how to interrogate these ideas. They kind of think, well, the adults say it, so shall it be. And so we have to really begin to understand that. And Joe, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add, the Southern Poverty Law Center on their website has a hate map that's very similar to the heat map. It kind of shows all the different hate groups that are out there around the United States. So I just wanted to make that connection. I thought it was really good map when I saw that, and this one also. Thank you.
Yeah, so we also have a hate symbols index that, and I believe it's like the same, because we often work with Southern Poverty Law Center, the same kind of thing. And it talks about hate symbols, and it is quite extensive. And it's really amazing the number of hate symbols that are out there, and things that we see that I know that I've seen and said like, whoa, I didn't even know, right? Whether it's on the back of somebody's car, right, at schools, right, parents, tattoos, right, things that you're like, oh my gosh, that are right plain, that are symbolic of their ideology. And the ideas and beliefs that they want to spread. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. And again, one of the things that I always reiterate to educators is that, one of the many things we're good at is finding information. And so the reality is that we have to do our homework, right? We have to do our homework. We have to do our research. Just as much as I am giving this information and, I know it like the back of my hand, I am always doing my homework because there are new things coming up every day. And it's true that, we may be, we ourselves may be in groups that have been marginalized, that have been targeted, or expert on certain issues, but we're not experts on everything, right? We don't assume all identities, or we may not know the needs, but that does not exempt us, right, from being responsive. And so we have to think about that. We have to do the work, and that's just what it is. And so bullying, violence, hate speech, all of that really does stagnate social emotional learning for children. And so we know that, again, if students don't feel valued and they don't feel safe, then they're not going to be present, and they're not going to be able to be in the best state that they can be to learn. And so oftentimes, identity-based bullying is a problem, or continues to be a problem in schools because it goes underreported and unresolved, right? So students don't say anything about it. Parents don't escalate it when administration is not being responsive. Administration, might write a letter, and that's as far as it goes, but it does nothing to change the culture and the expectation. And often school policies just continue to exclude explicit language about how incidents are classified, about accountability or repairing harm, and really because folks are uncomfortable with naming obvious threats to all of our well-being, right? For example, calling out hate speech, right? Or calling out incidents of clear anti-Semitism or racially biased incidents and saying things like, oh, we didn't know, or we're not sure, right? When all the signs are there, right? When all the things are there. And what this does is ultimately undermine our work in DEI. So we can have all the nice flowery words, we can have all the nice language, but if we are not setting forth practices and expectations, right, then it does no good, right? It's just words on paper. And so from top down, we have to, again, establish guidelines for respect, for inclusion, for equity and civility, even in the face of conflict. And we have to create accountability measures, right? How do we hold people accountable for these things when they're not doing their job, when they're not doing what they signed on to do, which is making sure that our young people have safe and inclusive places. And so when we don't do that, right, we only provide an opportunity for ourselves to be reactive instead of preemptive, right? And that's not the place and where we want to sit, because we know that schools are a microcosm of society, and we have to do more as we prepare these young people to go out into the world. Catherine, I saw your hand.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you, Samantha. As I'm looking at the data, it's making me think of a couple of some other data sources that are, that we can triangulate. One is the CHICS, survey, the California Healthy Kids, but also the Office of Civil Rights data, which I did in kind of another lifetime when I was the assessment and evaluation person in a district. And that Office of Civil Rights data is very detailed, and it talks about bullying and incidents that happen related to vulnerable, groups. And one thing that was interesting to me was that data isn't used a lot. It's submitted kind of as compliance, and there's lots of good stuff in there. And so I would invite people, if you can get access to the Office of Civil Rights data in your school district, that's another good way to triangulate that data.
I like that. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah. And let me be clear in that, right? We are but one source, but there are many. And you all have experts in your midst, right? Some of us have lived different lives and we've done different things. And so as you begin to have these conversations, often what you will find, like Catherine shared, is that you have folks that say like, oh yeah, I know about this, right? This is where we can get this and dig deeper, but you have to set the space for it. Right? If you were all sitting around acting like it doesn't happen, or acting like, right, the policy and the practices that we have is good enough, right, then we are never going to get there. And so it reminds me of, I was in a restorative justice a workshop a few years ago, and we were talking about behavior and how do we set norms, or how norms are set in the classroom, et cetera. And one of the teachers said, well, I'm not a social worker. I'm a teacher, and I can't necessarily be responsible for all these things. And quite frankly, my face was like, well, we're not by degree, but we know that students bring their stuff, right? We know that students don't just show up at school blank slates, and that if that student has had a conflict before they came to school, if they're having a conflict outside of school, whether it's online, whether it's family, that shows up, right? And so we have to acknowledge that that is kind of, it comes with the territory, right? Is that we have to manage behavior, we have to manage all kinds of things. That, yeah, it would be nice just to come to the classroom and teach math, right? But we have to get folks in the space. We have to make sure that students are even able to work in groups, right? So that if at your school there is interracial tension, right, you have to address that, because it's gonna stop students from coming together and doing the work that they need to do. It's gonna spill over, right? And then what do we do when that spills over? How do we create practices and policies that are responsive to that and that repair harm that's been done? And so again, just digging deeper and thinking about the levels of manifestation, right? We talk all the time about, one of the things I was talking to Nyambi about was that, we are talking a lot about anti-racism. We're talking about, white supremacy and white nationalism and the impact of that, that the historical implications of that, but then also that we need to start talking about these things like interracial tensions, right? Because they do exist, right? That although, many of us, again, have been victimized, have been harmed, right? We still harm each other, and it plays out in a multitude of ways. And some of you may see that in your schools and some of you may not. Sam?
Hey, thank you and good morning. I'm thrilled with the training, Samantha. I'm coming back to this idea of creating a container to have these hard conversations at the student level as it relates to RJ. In your earlier slide about the hate pyramid, how do we have conversations on the staff about bias, and how are we biased? And so kind of creating that space, creating that safe container to have these difficult conversations, bullying, bias, et cetera.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I will get there too. So this probably looks familiar to all of you, or should anyway. I was laughing with Nyambi earlier because I went to a school and did a training, and I asked, it was about 60, 70 teachers. And I asked them, I said, well, what are your values here? What do you value at the school? And they all kind of looked at me, and they were looking around. We were doing a training in the cafeteria. And I started looking around and I said, well, trust, worthiness, responsibility. They were all posted up around the cafeteria, but they were all looking at me for the answer. And I was looking at them like, well, you should know these things, right? But you really, and it's not to be funny. I mean, I chuckle to myself, but really, if we are not holding on to these, if we don't have these ingrained, right, when we go to work, when we are doing our work, and if we're not remembering these, then however, right, are we going to make a commitment to making sure that these things happen? So excellence and equity, right? We have to start to ask ourselves, like, what's excellence? What's excellence for somebody? How do you define excellence? So brief. That is a question. Sorry, not a rhetorical question, but if anyone wants to answer. Right. So one of the things that we can say that folks are not answering, but Joe is a brave person.
Thank you. Maybe just doing the best that one can do and just being successful in that way.
Okay, thank you. And so do we all agree with that? Right, that's the next question we have to ask. Do we all agree with that? So if we're asking for excellence, what does that mean? What does that look like, right? We can point to the dictionary definition of excellence, but then we all have to be in agreement around what does excellence look like for our students, for all of our students, right? If we say, oh, graduating from high school, going to college, right? How do we make that happen? If we say being able to, participate in like civic engagement, how do we make that happen for everybody, right? So we have to come up with a collective understanding of what excellence looks like. And then equity. What does equity look like? What is equity in your district, right? Even for those who you don't see, right? Even for your changing community, what does equity look like? And so we have to be intentional in the way that we demonstrate our values every single day. It takes practice. It's like muscle memory, right? We're going to make mistakes, but we have to keep going back to our core values and reminding ourselves and asking those critical questions. Am I doing? Is what I'm saying matching what I'm doing, right? Is it illustrating in the best way possible, right? The values that we say we have. And if not, that's okay. But then when you go back to the drawing board and you do it again, and we have to be willing to hear that from people. We have to be open to folks saying like, nah, it doesn't, right? We have to be open to hearing the voices of our parents and our families. And I know that's hard, right? I've been in schools, and sometimes, quite frankly, you see kids and you see their parents and you're like, oh, that's why you act the way you do. I get it. It's difficult working with parents sometimes, right? And some of us who are parents, we're like, it is hard working with administrators, right? Because sometimes as administrators and educators, we don't want to listen, or we feel like you don't understand our job. You don't understand what we have to go through, but we have to be open to that feedback, right? And that when a parent shows up, or when a family shows up and a community shows up and says like, this is not serving us well, listening to that, understanding that, asking why, right? Doesn't matter your intentions, because what we have to understand also is that our intentions, although they may be good, right, does not prevent harm. It doesn't stop harm from happening, right? And it doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of doing what's best, for the students that we serve. So any questions about that before we move on? Comments? All right. So how do we have those difficult conversations? Because the conversations are difficult. We do honor that. We know that, although we can do all these webinars, we can read the books, these are uncomfortable conversations to have. Oftentimes I use the example of myself is that, when we do workshops, folks don't want to talk, or they say, this is so hard. Can we just talk about this in a more subtle way? We don't want to be talking about like racism and race and sexism and the anti-Semitism. It's so hard to talk about. Why do we have to talk about this? We want to talk about being together and being a community. And I don't want to be talking about racism every day either, but it's here, right? So we have to address it. And it's here because we have yet to really talk about it and really unearth and deal with our own kind of wrongdoings and our own complicity in, right, all of these isms. And so first of all, we have to name it, right? We have to identify and we have to call out hate speech. We have to identify language that is exclusive, that is biased, right? We have to name that. And when we see propaganda, right, we have to call those things out. We have to practice and support things that are anti all of these things, right? And then we have to humanize it. We have to understand that the things that are happening, like this is not theoretical, right? It has a real-time impact on everyone. So for some people, they might think like, this is not, this is happening to their community, it's not that bad, but it has an impact on all of us, and we have to realize that. And we can't assume that everyone gets that. So we, again, have to be explicit in drawing out the implications of incidents. So saying things like, they didn't mean it, right? I often hear students, when we do workshops with students, like, oh, well, I know who, might have wrote that graffiti, or they told that joke, but I know they probably didn't mean it, right? And the reality is we never know anyone's intentions. But I bet that many of the folks online who are spreading extremist or hateful ideology at some point made those jokes in their peer groups. And at some point, right, folks said, oh, they didn't mean it, right? But here we are. And so we have to, again, do a better job of naming those things, of not being afraid to stand up and challenge and say, even if we're the only ones, right, speaking up and standing in that integrity and saying, like, this is wrong, right? This is not okay. And I know, like, maybe you don't understand this, but let me tell you why, right? And keep in mind the students and the families that we serve. So as we, do that, then we are able to develop concrete policies that do, in fact, ensure safety for all of our students, and again, promote equitable and inclusive spaces. And so before we go forward, I want to just take a minute to pause and do a self-reflection. I'll open it up to questions and comments, but just do a self-reflection and think about a time that you were a target of hate or bias. discrimination. What was the basis of that targeting? What was the basis of that hate or discrimination? And what age were you? How do you remember feeling or reacting? And then how were you ensured that it wouldn't happen again? Or were you? So just by show of hands, how many of you all thought about an incident from your youth when you were under 18? Mm-hmm. And then how many of you were reassured that it wouldn't happen again? And so you can lower your hand and then raise your hand again. Or were any of you reassured that it wouldn't happen again? And did you feel confident in that reassurance? Right. So nobody raised their hand, right? And so a lot of times these things happens in our school space. And I often think back to a time when I was in school, and I am older than I look. So I do remember a time where school felt like a safe place. When school was like the place you go to play, you go to learn, right? That was one of the safest places you can be. And unfortunately, we're not in that age anymore, right? Students don't feel safe at school. Teachers, educators, we don't feel safe at school. And so unfortunately, that's where these conversations really have to start, right? We know again that they're hard conversations to have, but they need to be had, and we need to create space for them. And so one of the ways that we can do that is creating guidelines around how we communicate with each other, quite simply. And so this is just an example of how we do, our ropes, so we call it rules of positive engagement strategies, which some of you might use, but setting kind of those guidelines for how do we communicate with each other, right? How do we make sure that everyone has a voice, everyone has equal stake in this, that folks are not going to be disrespected? How do we reel the conversation back in, right, when it goes left, because that also happens. And so it's really important that we set these guidelines for our peer space, our colleague space, but then also for our student space, and then also that we model that, right? So that, even when we are in the classrooms, we're talking from student to teacher, educator to student, to parents, that we, even as difficult as it may be, that we remember these things and that we model these things. Because whether we admit it or not, right, young people, they trust us, right? There's some level of trust that they have. And so we have to, again, kind of take advantage of that and understand the privilege that provides for us to be able to impact folks in a positive way. And so when we're having these conversations, there's a few things that we have to know. And when we set this up in the colleague space, and I'm just going to speak to the colleague space because we have to have this conversation amongst ourselves before we can have it with our students. And one of the reasons is because we need to make sure, we as an educators, that we are communicating the same values, and ideas, and disseminating the same information and beliefs, right? That we are consistent. So for parents, right, we might know that as a united front, right? So our parents, we know that our parents, for some of us, would disagree on things, but in front of us, a no was a no, and a yes was a yes, and then they hash it out behind the scenes. But we got the message, right? We got the message that you don't get to be disrespectful, for example. And so that's the message that we need to have. Whereas behind the scenes, we might disagree on what disrespectful is, right? We need to hash that out. And so one of the important things when we think about framing these difficult conversations is to understand who we're talking to, right? And the purpose of the conversation. So are we coming to the conversation to educate? And I would hope yes. Are we coming to the conversation to debate? Because sometimes it is. Are we coming to the conversation, to change folks' mind or just to gain understanding? And sometimes, we don't realize who we're talking to, and we don't think about that. Like, what is this person's experience? What role do they play? What is their context of understanding? Then summarizing the facts. So again, knowing, who your community is, the demographics of your school community, of your students, familiarizing yourself with trends regarding bias and incidents of hate. Learning more than definitions. So you said it, Nancy, beat me to the punch, but understanding actual ideology behind these things, right? In the historical context of policy and practice, and what that has done, and what you need to do to move forward. So one of the things that you can do to invite people in the conversation, because we do want to invite people in, right? We can't force them into that, but we can create space that is welcoming. Is that, we can use questions to invite people in and not assume, right, that everyone knows or that we understand everyone else's perspective or intentions, right? The key is to truly understand like what equity and inclusion look like in your space. So then you can model that for students and you can replicate that. And so this is hard because a lot of times in this work, when we have our ideas, a lot of times we shame folks, right, for what they don't know. And so we don't want to do that, right? We want to invite them into the learning because we don't know everything. An example is I used to, again, use is myself, that there are things that I know, but then there are identities I don't assume. So like my family is not a family of immigrants. I don't have that experience. So I don't know what that experience is like. And so when we are bringing people to the table, if they don't know the right vocabulary, right? If they don't know how to necessarily express certain things, then let's practice inviting them in and educating them so that they will sit in the conversation and understand that we still value you. And so one thing that we talk about is creating safe space, and we really have moved away from safe space to brave space, spaces where folks will speak up and confront issues as they happen. And one thing I do want to make clear is that although we do welcome in all perspectives, like we at ADL do not provide safe space for hate. We don't provide safe space for bigotry and for bigoted ideas. So if your ideology or your practices are contrary to creating safe, inclusive, equitable, civil, just society, then we don't support that, right? And there needs to be an opposite space. And I think that can be communicated also, right? When we think about how we handle incidents with students and parents, right? And reiterating that, like, this is our campus community and these are the things that we value. This is what our expectations are. And it's okay to say, and if you don't want to be a part of that, there are other options, but this is the expectation. We need to, again, seek to develop understanding instead of excluding, take action. So strategize and talk through the development of a plan, even if the first step of that plan is just a commitment to active learning, right? So some of you all express that you're reading books, or continue conversation, and then prompt response, right? So we have to have steps in order. We have to have concrete steps that continues to inspire us and to push us to progress, right? Not to sit in that comfort, because there will come a time where we're like, oh, we know all the definitions, right? So then where do we go there? We don't want to stop there. We want to then understand more and more and more. So we have to have steps in place that continue to be progressive in that way. Any questions about that? Comments? Okay. So I know it's approaching, it's 12, so I'm going to finish up here. And so, what are ways that we can help guide your processes and shift culture is through resources. So one of the initiatives that we have in our education program is our World of Difference Institute. And our World of Difference Institute is the umbrella through which we do our anti-bias work. And so we provide workshops for teachers or for educators, students, and families around general anti-bias. Sometimes they are more specific to certain topics. So like our topic here today is on policy. Sometimes they might be on things like specifically microaggressions, the things that are relevant like to your community. And really it's about getting folks out of their own way in terms of their thinking so that we can begin to start changing culture. And then we have our No Place for Hate initiative, which is our K through 12 school climate initiative. And really it's about championing the work of DEI, right, or of equity and inclusion. And so one of the things that we like to point out is that, you know, when we have like diversity, we're in the Bay Area, so we kind of have diversity by default, right? There's nothing necessarily that any of us have done in our schools per se or in our communities to create diversity. But when like we have equity and inclusive practices, then the diversity will come. And so diversity really is a result of equity and inclusion, and we should think about it in that way. That when we create spaces that are inviting, when we create spaces that are inclusive, then we will see families and we will see people of different, different beliefs, different identities pop up and be active participants in our communities. And so we really should be championing equity and inclusivity and not sitting on the idea of focusing on just diversity, right? Because we're past the point where we are, celebrating diversity. We know it exists, we know there's strength in it, but we have to do more than that. And so on our site, we also have a ton of free lesson plans from K through 12 that are based on current events through our current events classrooms, and they are standards-based curriculum on a multitude of subjects. You can go on there and search them by theme. We also have what we call our table talks, our family conversations. So tools for just framing conversations around pretty much any topic you can think of. And it's funny because oftentimes, again, we just don't know how to get the conversation started, right? We don't know how to have a conversation with students or with parents. And this gives some pointed questions and some background information and pointed questions around that topic. And then always literature. I am a proponent of literacy, and literacy is, an amazing means by which we can expose folks to different narratives. And I do believe that oftentimes people act in the way they do is because they don't know, right? They don't have a different narrative. And so when we expose young people at a young age to different narratives, to different stories, and they have the ability to think critically and mitigate, those moments when they have to think about different ideologies and make decisions around what is biased, what is not, right? What is true, what is not. And then we have standards-based curriculum. So we do have curriculum, a whole high school curriculum that's focused on confronting bias and championing equity. And so those are tools that are available for you if you so choose to use them. Our No Place for Hate program is actually a free program. So schools can sign up in May when registration goes out. And really it is about championing the work that you're already doing. So schools sign up, you create a committee, you're required to do 2 to 3 school-wide activities around confronting your issues of bias. So whatever's relevant to your school. So for some schools, it might be around digital citizenship. It might be confronting issues of ableism, anti-Semitism, whatever. And then at the end of the year, we recognize you as No Place for Hate school in our region. And this is a national program. So what I did mention is we have 25 offices across the country that participate in No Place for Hate. So then you are part of that movement. And it's just a good way to get, again, students excited about the work as well as families and teachers in a creative way. And then also speak to and highlight the work that you all are already doing, because I know many of you are already doing this work, and trying to step it up in different ways. So with that, Naomi, I am going to stop sharing as I've talked. I think enough. And open it up for questions, comments. If you do have questions that come up, I will be here for the next hour, so you can write them down and we can come back to them. But thank you so much for the questions and comments you did make.
Thank you, Samantha. That was Wonderful. Lots of good information. Any questions at this time? Nope, no hands raised. Okay. I apologize. The phone is ringing in my house, so please ignore that.
Marlena had a question. Am I saying your name correctly?
Let me unmute her.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate this talk. This is really important. I'm wondering if I could get a copy of your resources from your slide presentations. Are those going out to the participants? This is really wonderful.
They are, yeah. I will send out to Niambi the last slide with the links to resources. So one thing I didn't show was that I had specific links to resources. So there are lesson plans on, the dangers of disinformation, for instance, the power of protest, outsmarting the lure of propaganda. So our teaching and learning team, I can't take credit for creating these resources, but our teaching and learning team are really on it. And vet their resources, do their homework on issues that are present and relevant and that are unfolding across the country. And so I will absolutely share those with you.
Excellent. And do you have more resources for your challenging, courageous conversations piece? I was really interested in that.
We do, yeah. And there are some links for that as well.
Well, thank you.
Other questions at this time? Yes. Carla, can you unmute? Yeah.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, thank you so much, Samantha and Ambi, for hosting this. I'm curious if you could, Samantha, if you could speak a little bit more to what you just shared regarding how schools can, or school districts could sign up for the No Place for Hate in May, which is just around the corner. Would love to hear more about that.
So the link will go out in May, and actually I can send it directly to Niambi. So usually if you're on our mailing list, we have, and I do actually recommend that you all, and I'll put the link, drop the link in the chat, sign up for our newsletters and mailing lists, because weekly, our education team sends out resources, free resources that you can use online. And you'll be on our mailing list for when we send out like the No Place for Hate registration, but it's just registration goes out, you have to fill in all of your school information. Again, it will give you the steps to like everything from forming a committee to what you should be thinking of. There's a No Place for Hate guide. And again, it is really a framework. It's not us dictating to you what you have to do. There are activity proposals, so there are guidelines for it. So for instance, what we push people away from. So one of the things that we had to address was like, kindness. Like when we kind of first started this, a lot of people were like, oh, we're going to do kindness week. And while kindness is all good and well, we were past that point. And so we need to be talking about respect. We need to be talking about dignity. We need to be talking about other things because kindness is a given. And so we want folks to really be pushing in and having those uncomfortable conversations. And again, doing the work that they need to be doing, but really we just want to be a resource and help you champion that, right? So a lot of times I know that you all are kind of inundated with parents kind of like, what are you all doing about this? How are you addressing this? And why aren't you doing this? And why aren't you doing that? And they don't know the work that you're doing behind the scenes. I think, it's hard to necessarily, draw out all the time, all the things that you're doing. But we know that you are doing things. And so we want to help you promote that. We want to invite parents in. So No Place for Hate, we do also ask that, you invite parents to participate in that and be on your committee. We also ask that there are students on those committees, as well as teachers and administrators. So it really is about building community on your campus in an authentic way.
Other questions? Oh, Samantha, actually, I have a question. For the No Place for Hate, I know the registration comes out in May. Is there like a deadline in order to implement it for the next year?
Yeah, deadline, yes, so you have to sign the No Place for Hate pledge, and it's a series of like 7 statements that says like, we are respectful of the school, very simple. And then that has to be done by October. And then all the rest is up to you. So there are some deadlines in the description and the guide. It draws out all of those things. So
Great. Okay, I'll pause one more time. Additional questions right now. We'll have time at the end as well if questions come up in the meantime. Okay. I will share my screen. All right, are you able to see it? Okay, wonderful. So I have the job of going through some of the kind of nuts and bolts of why we're here today. So Samantha gave us a lot of good context and information and things to help support us around context and creating these policies. But a big reason why we're here today, obviously Nancy mentioned it already, was from the grand jury findings. And I just want to point out that those findings were based on high schools policy. So they didn't look at K-12 policies, but that doesn't mean that what we're talking about today doesn't apply to all levels. Some of the highlights that were in those findings, and I'll share the findings with you as well for those of you who didn't see them when we share out the resources. But one of the highlights in the findings was that few incidents of hate were reported on the school sites. And so some people interpreted that to mean, oh, our culture is great and we don't have it here. And so I would challenge that assumption in that we do want to create a space where students feel comfortable reporting hate and parents reporting these incidences, and not just assuming that if you don't get a lot of reports that means it's not happening on your site. Another kind of highlight from the findings was around the details and the policies. And so they found that some policies lacked a lot of detail, and then kind of the details were all over the place. They weren't consistent. And so we wanted to come here today just to talk about some of those key elements that we think you all should have in your policy so that you can make sure you're keeping these things in mind as you're creating your policies. So I'll run through this really quickly. We've already gone over this quite a bit, but policy language is very important because it does guide your actions and your decisions, and it kind of determines what your culture is going to be. It kind of defines, this is what we believe, these are our values, and lets students and staff know what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. So being very explicit in your policy language to get everyone on the same page, to have the same understanding about what we do share in terms of values and ethics is very important. This slide has a lot of words on it, so you can ignore that. I just pulled this straight from the CDE, and I just wanted to throw this in here because we do have legal obligations as well in terms of the districts to have universal complaint procedures in place. And so this kind of harassment piece is just part of a larger universal complaint procedures that all the districts have to have. And so again, I will share the link with you so you guys can refer to this on the CDE website. But really, legally, LEAs are responsible for creating and maintaining the documents around their complaint procedures. And so you do have legal obligations around this, but I think it is more than just legal obligations as well. And so I wanted to start with a quote from our state superintendent, Tony Thurmond, on a reason why this is so important. And so I quote, "We do not need any more evidence that our country is facing two pandemics, coronavirus and hate. It feels like every day we are seeing heartbreaking examples, more anti-Semitic behavior, bullying of Asian American students because of our previous president's rhetoric, Islamophobia, discrimination of our LGBTQ neighbors, and violence directed at people of color. It's time to double down on our efforts to combat all forms of hate, bias, and bigotry. He goes on to say, I believe education can provide the pathway to healing, understanding, and racial and social justice. And so I really like this quote because it kind of sets the foundation. We are in a state of crisis right now. And so in this process, we really want to address this and create an environment where we can support our students as we're going through this state of crisis. The CDE does have a brochure that kind of is a kind of sweet, short thing around discrimination and harassment, intimidation. So we will include that in your resources as well, just so you can kind of see their views on it. But again, these are legal regulations, even though morally it is very important as well. So some of the importance in education, you know, we know we're here for the students. That's why we're all here. That's why we're all in education. And so this piece about protecting our students, protecting their rights, protecting their interests is key. It's paramount to why we're here. And so we do want to provide a safe environment for them. We want them to be able to learn free of violence and fear. When you're scared, when you're afraid, it is challenging to learn if you can learn at all. And so we are obligated to provide a prompt, predictable response for them. So they know they can trust if something happens. You know, the adults around me know how to respond. They'll respond quickly and they'll respond in a way that I can, that I'm aware of, that I already can expect. Unfortunately, as Samantha already pointed out, bias and hate acts occur very often in our society. And so it creates an environment where people are tense and have conflict. And even these acts, by their very nature, are confrontational. And so they create kind of this social hostility environment. And so we want to really make sure that we're counteracting that. And so when we have these acts that happen on our sites or even outside of our sites, they do create a hostile environment for our schools. And then obviously it's incompatible with learning. So teaching and education is the mission for all of our schools. And so this kind of hostile environment is incompatible with that. And so it really deprives students of their fundamental right to learn. And so these are really kind of key reasons why this policy and kind of setting the tone is so important. We really want students to have a place where they can learn. One thing about students is you hear adults say a lot that, you know, our children are resilient. And yes, our children are resilient. Our students are resilient. This is true. But they're also very vulnerable to emotional injury. And so just saying, oh, they're resilient, you know, they'll be okay, that's not appropriate. Even though they are resilient, it doesn't mean it won't have lasting effects on them. So you have to think, just because this thing is happening to them now, it can affect them for years to come. And so we want to make sure that we are supporting them, helping them heal, and having programs where if something does happen to them, we can help them recover. Another reason I think this is very important for our students is just around their maturity level. So, you know, students don't always have the social skills yet or the maturity to address their frustrations, their anger, if something happens to them. And so as adults, as the administrators, it is up to us to really have those structures in place, those programs in place to help them address whatever may have happened to them. The research shows that when you don't kind of have these social skills, then the potential for escalation really does increase. And so we don't want our students to escalate these situations. We want to be able to help them deal with the situations. And the escalation can really lead to retaliation. And so the other part about this is it won't necessarily stay on your campus. And so if students are in kind of retaliation mode, it can go off campus, it can be outside of school hours. And so you can't necessarily contain it to the school day on your campus. So unfortunately, the Uniform Crime Reporting System actually says that, many bias crimes are committed by children. And so we know that they are significant offenders, even if they don't have that hate intent. And so they found that a lot of times, when they do these acts, it's either motivated by ignorance or they just want attention. Children, our students, they need attention. So sometimes they do things out of needing attention, or they think it's a prank. And so Samantha spoke to this earlier too. And so they have different reasons why this might occur, but regardless of their intent, we won't ever really know their intent. We have to be able to express that it's not tolerated, because harm to others cannot be tolerated, even if they thought it was a joke. Yeah, Samantha spoke to this as well, but I just want to bring this back up because people often try to use the First Amendment to kind of squash these acts of hate and bias. And I'd say, yes, we do have the First Amendment. We want our students to use it, and it's not an excuse to cause harm. So the First Amendment does not trump students or adults causing harm to other students. And so, yes, we have the First Amendment, but we want to keep in mind it does not trump causing harm to students. The good news. So at schools, we have the power to help shape this for our students. And so schools are really a place where it's the first time a lot of us are exposed to people who are different from us, different from our families. And so that can be in race, that can be in ableism, that can be in religion, that can be in ethnicity. I mean, it can be in a variety of things, even body type. A lot of students say they get bullied over body type. So it could be all types of different characteristics that are different from your own. And so we really want to use school as this natural setting where we can teach students how to interact with people who are different from themselves and learn those social skills. In addition, we know that early on socialization, it determines your future attitudes and beliefs. And so we want to take this opportunity while we have our students, while we can work with them to really help them develop attitudes and beliefs that help them appreciate and respect those that are not like them. So I want to take a little moment just to reflect and talk about your why, your district's why. And so we talked a little bit about, there is a legal requirement for you to address this, but outside of just kind of the legal reason, I wanted to just take a moment for everyone to pause, jot your own notes down. It's just a silent moment, and really answer the question, why is it critical for your district to create and implement a strong policy on anti-hate and anti-bias? And I'm just going to pause for a moment so that we can personally reflect on that. Does anyone have a strong why that they would want to share with us outside of, like, legally we're obligated, obviously, of why it's important for this policy in their district in particular? And Joe, I'm trying to unmute you. Let me see. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I think one reason would be to make sure that we're always being strong advocates for students and for their well-being and their safety. So for me, it's almost like that simple, that I just want to be that advocate for a student who is experiencing something negative like that. And then also to try to be an intermediary between the party that's causing the aggression or the negative act, and with the student who's trying to solve that, trying to work through that, trying to help those students as much as possible.
I like that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Catherine.
I think that we as educators, we shape students and we help to determine what happens now in terms of how they interact with others. But I think that we also shape the future. So if we're training students to behave in a certain way, that determines how young adults and adults will behave, right, in the future. So I think we're shaping the future.
Yes, I will clap to that. I couldn't agree more. Anyone else want to share? Carla, are you able? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'm actually have a question about the question more than anything. I'm curious about still kind of the language as I just so to be consistent with the language that we're all encouraged to adopt at this time, that it's still on anti-hate and anti-bias, and there's a bit of a kind of inconsistency of when it's okay to say anti-racism and when not to, like when, like, is anti-bias in place of anti-racism? Do we include anti-racism with these other so I'm just curious. I don't know if there's a specific, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, not at all. I think that's an excellent question.
I'm just curious about messaging and policy and language that districts are encouraged to use.
Yes, that is an excellent question. And I'll answer it the way I see it. I will invite others to answer as well, since they are at the district level. But what we're trying to do is actually a policy that encompasses any kind of hate or bias. And so I do think the anti-racism piece is encompassed in there. We want it, I'll say that. We want it to be encompassed in there. But your policy, we do want to have explicit definitions around things. So I do think if you want to define that explicitly, great, that would be awesome. But we do want to make sure that we're defining multiple types of bias or hate and giving examples so that students know it is race, but it's also other things as well, like disability, like whatever those isms are. And so I think that is why those definitions are important. Talking about them is important. But yes, you're more than welcome to include that in there, but we want to make sure that we're talking about multiple kind of aggressions and hate. But I welcome anyone else's comments. Oh, Samantha.
I was going to say, I just wanted to add to that question, say yes to what Niambi just said, and also why it's important, right, to point out, as Niambi said, anti-bias and anti-racism is because, yes, we're talking about different forms of bias, but when we don't mention the language, right, there's the excuse to ignore that it doesn't, or act like it doesn't exist, right? Like we're talking about systemic racism and inequity in education as if it's a new trend, right? And if any of us know the history of schooling, right, in the United States and education, like we know this is not a new trend. And so unfortunately, right, we have to be very explicit, as if we are writing like children's books, right? And really drawing that out. Because if we don't have the language in there, then folks will say, well, I didn't know, you didn't say that. You know, how are my kids supposed to, how do you classify that? Why are they being disciplined for this and that? So.
Yes. Pamela, are you able to unmute? There you go.
Okay, yeah, I'll just refer back to Superintendent McGee's reference to Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist to maybe help provide an answer to this question. You know, Kendi talks about policy being either racist policy or anti-racist. And, there's no in between there. So I think, that really encourages us to look at our existing policies, to identify how they may be racist, and then to develop more anti-racist policies. He also speaks to really this approach of, stop trying to change the hearts and minds of people. It's a lot of work to get people to try to confront biases that they may hold, to, address the white privilege and fragility that is so strong in our institutions, and to use policy, and to go straight to policy as a way to combat racism.
I agree. I'm gonna say a yes, and I think you can work on both, because I do think it's a combination of trying to also work on those mindsets while you're working on policy. And the reason I say that is, we have like Brown versus Board, like we have policy, but when you go into our schools, they're very segregated. And so I think people try to find ways around policy also. And so I think that's why we need kind of a dual approach. So policy, but also mindsets is my personal opinion.
And I think also too, Yambi, is that we have to really look at education as a transformative practice, and that being what informs our pedagogy, right? We do it because we want students to learn like hard skills, right? Which is great, but then, education really should be transformative. At least that's the way in which we believe, in which I believe. And so saying those things, like you said, it holds us to the responsibility of, holds educators the responsibility of doing that in their work and using it as such a tool.
Any other comments before we move on? Our time. Okay. Good on time. Okay, please bear with me as I go through this list, but I did want to talk about just some basic policy elements that should be in your policies, and then we'll talk about some additional considerations as well. And so one reason I asked you to do the self-reflection around what is your district's why is because your policy should start with your commitment. Like, what is your commitment to protect your students and to support them? And so you really do, as a community, need to think about what that why is to go at the top of your policy to set that context. As we've been talking, you want to be able to identify types of harassment. So really being explicit, giving examples. Carla, if you need to define what these pieces are, what all these different types of pieces are, that is great, because I think the more kind of explicit examples you can give, the better for folks who are reading your policy. Obviously, your policy needs to require that staff report these incidences. So if they encounter something or hear about something, learn about something, they are required to report it. And so that needs to be explicitly stated in your policy, as well as how to report it. So what are your mechanisms? The law, actually, you have to identify someone for this complaint procedure. And so who is that person or people or team? Who are those people who someone would report to? So you can have an official person, but we also, of course, want to set up a structure where folks feel comfortable reporting to different people. So it shouldn't just be, although you need your official person for the law, it shouldn't just be that one person. You need different mechanisms for reporting. Really being explicit about the steps you're going to take. And so really thinking about that ahead of time. What are our steps? How do we, if we receive something, if we know about something, what are our steps to address it? So what are our formal complaint procedures for folks who need to kind of report that something has happened, but then also what are our steps internally to address those? Retaliation is always a big one. And so your policy should have some really explicit language around prohibiting retaliation. And so in terms of retaliation, you want explicit language about, if someone has reported something, they can't be retaliated against. But even as you begin to kind of investigate whatever has happened, if you involve any other person in that investigation, they should not be retaliated against either. And so being explicit that it's not just the person who had the thing happen against them, but it's anyone involved kind of in the process of investigation should not face any type of retaliation. And then the last piece is around just making sure that everyone is aware of the policy, their rights and their responsibilities. So making sure students know their rights and responsibilities, staff, as well as parents and in your community. And so these are like just some basic things that should all be included in your policy. Any questions? Yes. There it goes.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could speak to what kind of policy elements might help in incidents of kind of like one student says one thing happened and another student says, no, that's not what happened. You know, when it's I don't know, he said, she said kind of a situation, right? Where, you know, the harm is obvious, but there isn't an agreement or a willingness to listen around impact. And instead there's, you know, in times when there isn't any explicit proof of exactly what was said or why, when you're having denials from a perpetrator, what kinds of policy elements can help support getting to a place of enforcing anti-bias, anti-hate, even when kids are saying, no, that's not what I did?
I think that's a good question, because you're going to have a lot of kids that are like, nope, I didn't do that. But I think it's thinking through what your process of investigation is. And so I know there are different programs and processes to understand both sides of a situation and to I would say understand both sides of the situation so that you can have kind of a restorative conversation around it. I will have to get back to you in terms of explicit he said, she said, and then you can't get to kind of what happened at the bottom. And so I think that will be addressed in our next session, because we really do I want to bring us back together to really talk about some of those best practices of how folks do address these situations. Today, we're specifically talking about kind of elements and context, but we do want to come back together to say, what are your programs that are helping students understand ahead of time for prevention? And then what do you all do when things do come up? How do you address them? Because there's different levels and context. Like, you know, if things are criminal, there's certain steps you have to take versus more kind of he said, she said, let's do some restorative circle type thing. So we will still address that. But I think it is a good question. And I think sharing together how folks address that will be helpful. Catherine.
I just wanted to swing back to a comment that you had made about policy playing a certain role, but it goes beyond policy, that it also involves people, right, and the way they interpret things. And I just wanted to share, there's an article that we've been using related to equity and diversity and inclusion. It's called The Water of Systems Change. Mm-hmm. And I think it's Kanya, Kammer, and Senge, and it's really good because it talks about mindset, power dynamics, relationships, resource allocation, policy, and practice. Mm-hmm. And if you don't fix one, I mean, if you only take care of one, it doesn't address the other thing. So that kind of gets us to really dig in and make sure that we make a difference beyond just developing a policy.
Thank you, Catherine. I do know that article, so I will make sure I include that for everyone when I send out the resources. Any other questions just on the basic kind of list or anything else? Okay, be mindful of time. Okay, so We also want to think beyond the basics. So I shared a basic list with you, but again, talking about your definitions of incidences and also hate speech. And so a lot of the policies didn't talk from the grand jury report, didn't talk about hate speech. And so really not only describing different types of incidences that you're looking for, but what do you consider hate speech? And so that again is a conversation that your community has to have to say, this is what we're talking about, so that you can be explicit when you get ready to draft your policy. Some other staff considerations, staff are required once they find out about something to report it. But you actually want to train your staff if they think something is going to happen, if they anticipate, if they hear in the wind, we want to be proactive around this. And so when you think about your policy, it's not just what they already know about, but it's also if they suspect something, you want to get ahead of it, you want to address it. And that also includes if they hear about things that are happening with your students off campus or outside of school hours, making sure that staff know you still have the responsibility to get ahead of this and report this so we can address it. Preventive measures. And so we'll talk a little more about this in the second session, but really making sure your policy has kind of programs and education and pieces so that students don't even engage in the behavior in the first place. So we're really trying to help students understand what these things mean so that they're actually not engaging in the behavior. And so what are those programs you're going to put in place? What does that education look like? What does that training look like? So that we do have preventive measures in our policy as well, and not just reactive measures. As Samantha mentioned, that online piece, I don't think a lot of our regulations haven't caught up yet with the fact that a lot of this stuff happens online. And so even though you're not required to put it in your policy, you really want to think about that online piece and what are you going to do if you find out that things are happening online with your students, and how do we address that? And then the timing of the response. It's commonplace to just say, oh, we'll respond quickly, but really think about what does quickly mean? What does prompt really mean? Timing is very important because students need to know that, number one, we know how to address something that happens. But also it lets them know, okay, they are committed to supporting me. They are really understanding that this is hurtful. And so responding quickly and fast will actually help your community have confidence in your policy. And then the copycat potential. So if you don't respond quickly, it actually unwittingly sends a message to other students that, oh, that was okay, and now I can do it. And so that quick response is really important to just kind of squash any kind of copycat potential that may occur. Some other things to consider when you're creating your policy is making sure that it's aligned to other policies in other places. As humans, we need to see things more than once. We need to hear things more than once. And so the more you can kind of reinforce your official policy through other places like your students' code of conduct, or even in your personnel policy. So your teachers know, again, what their responsibilities are around this. So making sure that whatever you guys come up with for your general policy is also kind of repeated and reinforced and aligned in other places as well. One thing that came up in the grand jury was around materials and accessibility. And so again, you all are thinking of policies for your community. We have samples, but you still want to think about what does my community need? So, translations, like what languages do you need to ensure you have your policies translated into? And making sure that the language is accessible. So they found that some policies are written in a way where, yes, it's English, but it's like, I don't know what this is saying because the language is not accessible. So thinking kind of 7th to 9th grade level to make sure that all the students have access to the language, but as well as parents and community members as well. So some of the resources we will share with you. The California School Board Association has a sample board policy. So this isn't your policy that's going to like name all these details. It's really the piece that kind of goes to board. And so the piece that goes to board then references your policy that has all the details and the definitions, and this is how we're going to do it. But you do still need to make sure that you have submitted to board your policy and that it has been approved by board. So that first bullet, you'll have a sample of just kind of the board language around your policy. And then I will include a sample policy. Thank you, San Mateo Union High School District, for sharing their policy with me. It was very good, very detailed. And so we are using some of that. I added just a little bit about anonymous, because that's another piece. They found that a lot of policies don't name how students can report anonymously, or if something happens against them anonymously, how are you going to take care of it? So, if you don't even have the he said, she said, because something happened to a student, they don't even know, who the offender is. What do you do in that case? And so that's just the little piece that we needed to add. But other than that, it was a great policy, had lots of details, lots of definitions. Again, don't just take it and copy it. You want to think about what makes sense for your community. And so you can use that as a starting point, though. And then I'll also share the grand jury findings with you, because I don't know that everyone received those, just in case you didn't. So county support. We can be a repository for your district policies. We do want to be able to facilitate kind of best practices or language. And so really being able, I'm not requiring that you guys submit your policies, but if you are willing, we would love to be able to collect those so that we can share them amongst each other about, different definitions, different languages, different ways that you guys phrase things. Like I said before, we're having a second policy session more around training and communication and support. So less around the actual policy details, but more around the implementation pieces. And in the meantime, if you guys are working on your policies, you want review or comments, we have in-house counsel. We have a team of communications that can look at it. So please feel free to send it our way. If you want someone to review, or if you want comments, or if you want feedback, I welcome that. And so our key question for our next session is really around, now that you kind of have drafted this policy, what are you going to do to make sure that everyone knows about it? Both around, prevention and our education piece, but then also around if something does happen, how we're going to address it. And what I don't have on here also is around how are you going to create safe, brave space for students to be able to report, because even if they know about your policy and know who to report to, you still have to create kind of an environment where they feel comfortable doing that. And so we'll talk about a little bit about that next time. The next session is scheduled for May 21st at 2 p.m. I know everyone is really stressed and has a lot on their plate, but we really want to have the session before the start of school, because in the fall is when you actually need your plan in place of how you're going to inform all your students, how the staff know. So we wanted to come back and meet with you all ahead of time so you could be ready to hit the ground running in the fall with your education and your communication. And so our next session is really about, how are you going to train your staff? How are you going to communicate with your students and your parents and public as well? Questions for me at this time? I want to be respectful of you all's time because we said 2 hours. So make sure I can see everyone. Okay, I don't see any questions, any comments before we leave. This was good today just to see you all here. So I'm excited about this. Oh, it looks like Lindsay has a question or a comment.
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering, can you share specifically the SMU HSD anti-hate, anti-bias policy that you were referring to? Can you share specifically what that one is? Which one you're speaking to?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
You said that there was an example that was going to be included.
Oh, yes. So I'm going to send that because it's a PDF. And it's not actually ours. It was from San Mateo Union High School District. But yes,
right. That's where I work.
Oh, yeah. Yes. No, I would definitely send that to you.
Okay.
Along with all the other things. It was just I couldn't get it into the chat. So
yeah, the chat's but yeah, because it's been disabled. That's fine. Is it the protocol for responding to incidents, or is it something different? Do you remember?
There's a lot in there. So it's responding. There's some links to forms that you can use. There's some definitions in there. So it's maybe like 5 pages long. So there's a lot of pieces to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Betty.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing work. And I'm really excited by kind of translating Kendi's work into anti-racist, anti-bias policies in schools. And I just am hoping that maybe as we follow up in the next conversation to think about how we can create educative spaces to talk about bias and hate. I'm thinking about things getting reduced to zero tolerance. And instead, I know Learning for Justice is really talking about zero indifference and having a place that has strong policies against hate, but also is really cognizant of the transformative power of education. And working with young people, it's this really interesting balance. So that's just a gray area as a practitioner I'm really struggling with and hope we can keep talking about.
Okay, thank you. Are there other things people want me to think about before the second session? Because that's a good one. Carla, 1 second. There you go.
Hi, Niambi. Yes, I think I saw it on your list, but just emphasizing how critical it is to engage families in the planning, designing of these policies, how they will be implemented, because without their buy-in, support, and engagement, how effective it is will be limited. So creating these safe and supportive and welcoming school climates needs to also be embraced and supported at home.
Yes, couldn't agree more. And Ms. Treadway.
Hi, thank you so much. I would also love resources on how districts can go about rewriting mission statements, vision statements, interpreting core values. So not so much classroom activities or parent activities, but how leadership teams can incorporate these ideas into their overall mission and vision statements.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh no, my
Ellen, I think, had her hand raised.
Oh, there you are.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really, really valuable. I'm curious if maybe the next time we could have some time to go into breakout groups with Java likes. I'm in an elementary school, and so I would love to have time to talk to other elementary school principals and administrators about what this might look like at their school, as well as, in the classrooms, what type of activities they're doing. And I can see that my secondary colleagues and administrators would probably benefit from that time too. So that was just an idea for next time. Thank you.
Yes. Ms. Treadway, did you have a Another question?
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Thank you so much for this session.
You're welcome. Any other comments or needs for the next session? And just a warning, my computer is at 2%. I'm so sorry I did not plug in. So I hope it doesn't just cut me off right now, even though I might make it till 12. So any other comments or suggestions? Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I look forward to continuing this work. And please, please, please reach out if you have additional suggestions, if you need support in Clay at smcoe.org. I am here for you. We are here for you. So we're here for the students, obviously, all of us. So please reach out if you need anything, and I will be in touch with your resources later today.